Okay, class, so in this video, we're going to be looking now at Aristotle's actual philosophy, right? We were kind of talking more about his life and his influence. Now, in the previous video, now we're going to be looking at his philosophy in general, an overview. When you start to read Aristotle's actual writing, you'll see that his work is not expounding this grim, lifeless system, right? It's not him just sort of like telling you his ideas. To each philosophical problem that he considers, his approach is still dialectical and tentative and exploratory. You know, similar to Plato's dialogues, there's this back and forth between Socrates and his interlocutors, right? And they're asking questions and they're trying to figure out what the right answer is. That's what Aristotle is doing in his writings, except they're not dialogues. He's kind of having this internal conversation with himself. He expounds and he elaborates on lines of thought that ultimately, after careful consideration, he's going to reject, you know. So that's what Socrates and his interlocutors were doing. He is careful to review the opinions on any topic before deriving and announcing his own conclusion. So he basically says, okay, let's ask this question. What some people think about this issue? And he tries to cover all of the options. And then ultimately he assesses the pros and cons before giving his own view on the matter. He's always pausing, kind of digressing, dealing with objections and difficulties. We're really reading an eternal debate, an internal debate, rather than a monologue. So that's, you know, what philosophy is really, right? There are a lot of common features among his works that we can identify. One of these is his logic. The man literally invented logic. He is a logician. And so you see that throughout his entire work. There is, as we'll see, his doctrine of the four causes, which is one of his metaphysical teachings. There's the conception of substance that he exposits. This is, again, his metaphysics. But it's kind of present everywhere in his thought. And then there's this notion that he has, which is a very scientific notion, of development and end or purpose, which is what we'll explain later. But we really see it come to fruition in ethics. Now, as far as logic, its importance is twofold. He doesn't necessarily see it as a branch of philosophy nowadays like we see it, but rather as the method of philosophy. For Aristotle, you need logic to do philosophy. You cannot do philosophy without logic. It's like if you tried to do physics without math. It can't be done. You have to use math to do physics, right? He was the first to grasp the formality of logic. And what I mean by that literally is the form the logic has, the structure that reasoning has. And the fact that it is objectively neutral, right? That it's not a matter of opinion. It's similar to mathematics in that, you know, it doesn't matter whether or not you think that 2 + 2 is 4. Like, you can't disagree and think that it's 5. It is 4, no matter what you think. And the same thing is true of logic, believe it or not. So this allowed him to study patterns of reasoning, and we see this constantly throughout his work. The second important thing, we can look to his writings like Categories and On Interpretation. And, you know, here the emphasis is on his idea that all significant assertions consist in attributions of properties to things. He's talking primarily about what can be said about things meaningfully. And he's basically saying that what we can say of things meaningfully is what they are, what properties they have. In the Categories, he asks the question, what kind of questions can be asked about things in the world, and what kind of answers are appropriate to such questions. Here, what he's saying is that anything that can be spoken of is either a thing or an attribute of a thing. In his work on interpretation, he says that every proposition is either true or false. even if there are some uses in language to where truth or falsity is ultimately irrelevant. This is all logic. If you have any experience with logic, you may be able to appreciate this, but as we read Aristotle, you'll almost kind of like absorb some of logic through his writing. The effect of his logic on the doctrine of four causes is also clear and decisive. And again, we'll discuss the four causes in greater detail, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that logic is pervasive there. In modern science, we think of causation as primarily a relation between events, but for Aristotle, the four causes were of things or substances. The doctrine is intended to account for how particular substances come to be and why they have the properties that they do. So for Aristotle, the four causes each have a corresponding question. And again, this is just an overview. We'll talk about this in greater detail in a later video. But he basically says that there are four basic things that you could say of a thing. What it is made of, how it was made, and why it was made. These are the properties that things have, and he asks of everything that he studies. The search for substance is the search for that which most truly and essentially is. And if you think about that, that's a very philosophical idea. Understanding Aristotle's metaphysics, we kind of see how he differs from Plato in this respect. His teacher, Plato, is more abstract and favors applications, for instance, in mathematics, right, when it comes to metaphysics. But Aristotle, however, sees his view best applied in biology, knowledge of plants, botany, zoology, knowledge of animals. So it's a very empirical view of reality compared to Plato's dualistic conception, where the emphasis was on the spiritual or the rational. In in Aristotle's works, he discusses the end or purpose of things, and from there he goes on to discuss ethics, politics, and even, believe it or not, literature. He's concerned with the concrete and the particular, whereas Plato is concerned with the general and the abstract. Still, like Plato, he's concerned with how we can acquire moral understanding to become better people and live better lives. You know, for him, he doesn't lose sight of what Socrates taught, or even what Plato taught, that philosophy is a way of life. And it is for him, actually, as it was for Plato and Socrates, the best way of life. For Plato, knowledge is knowledge of the forms. For Aristotle, knowledge is knowledge of the causes, a metaphysical concept, right? So these are the three aspects: the theory of substance, the theory of causation, and the view of the subject-predicate form of a proposition, which are really essential to understanding Aristotle's thought. And we'll look at how these are all applied to the reading that we're looking at this week, the metaphysics, in the next video.